Let's kick off, should we, with the... it's on the Times and the Observer, this sort of lateral flow test. The free test may be coming to an end.
Yes, indeed. It's the free lateral test that face the axe under plans for living under COVID-19, which Boris Johnson will announce within weeks. But I have to say straight away that the government has not confirmed any details of this story. It's very much underplaying the story, and nothing has been decided yet. But yes, it could be that people will now have to pay for a lateral flow test. But having said that, the story also makes it clear that a lateral flow test will be provided for free to people with symptoms and also in high-risk settings such as hospitals, schools and indeed care homes. So the most vulnerable people.
It suggests they're sort of scaling things back. But if you have to pay for your own lateral flow test, will you do it at all?
Well, this is the question, should people need to? Because I think one of the things that, and the Sunday Times quotes some comments from Nadine Zahawi talking about the fact that we need to move from this setting of it being a pandemic and an emergency to the virus being endemic, to us talking about it being really focused on the people who need the tests most importantly, so care workers or people working on the front line. And your average Joe who's going out to the local pub, do they really need to test? I think that's the question that the papers are asking. And indeed, in the Observer quotes Dr. Clive Dix, who was the ex-chief of the vaccine strategy, who is really quite forthright and is saying that rather than this just being one small step, we need to completely rethink the way in which we are dealing with this pandemic. As Nabila says, there's no official comments from government. There's certainly no ministers coming out and saying we're changing plan. But the mood across the papers this morning seems to be that...
It suggests they're talking about it,
to suggest that there could be a change of tone. I think lots of people might...
Well, is that all to do with the fact that we're changing our attitude slightly, or they want us to change our attitude, or is it a cost thing? Because this free test for everyone's cost about £6 billion, hasn't it?
Well, absolutely. I think the whole issue of coronavirus funding is obviously a hot potato politically, and yes, the government spent some £6 billion on testing, but private companies very close to the Tory party have also made huge profits during the pandemic. But I think, you know, more optimistically, perhaps this is a story about another sign that the pandemic is easing up effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder if it will... I suppose at some point we're going to have to suck it and see, aren't we? Try this sort of thing out and see if things get worse or whether they get better.
Yeah, and I mean, the Observer is a really interesting piece that goes on to talk about the fact that, you know, we often talk about the sort of initial things like whether testing works, whether or not people need the vaccine, but then we don't look at the costs of all the restrictions. And they go into the detail of the fact that, for example, lots of care homes have taken in 40% less of people in the last year, which is, you know, it means that care homes aren't working. It means that there's something fundamentally wrong. And we know that there's a direct link between problems in care homes and the restrictions that have been put in place. I think most people now are starting to, as the fact that Omicron has proven itself to be less harmful to health, certainly more prevalent in its ability to spread, but less the consequences for people's health are less serious than the Delta, for example. I think most people are now looking at the issue in hospitals, the issues in care homes, the issues in schools, and saying, is it really worth us continuing on this route of treating everything like an emergency when we can see people suffering on the other side of it?
What I haven't heard from any virologist or anyone saying, they all say that it is likely there will be another variant. What's the likelihood of that variant? Yes, but what's the likelihood of that variant being less than Omicron? In other words, things are getting better. Or could it be worse again?
Well, nearly all scientists are now saying they accept that coronavirus will never go away. That's a fact. And instead, immunity from infections, thanks to vaccination, will eventually make it no less severe than a flu, say. But we have to bear in mind that a year ago, about 1 in 10 cases resulted in hospital admissions, but now it is fewer than 1 in 50 cases. So there is definitely a change in how severe this terrible disease is affecting us.
Well, that's the vaccination programme for you, a lot of people would say. Let's kick off, Nabila, with the Sunday Times and Novak Djokovic.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we talk about COVID-19 affecting every aspect of life, and this is one of those stories that just becomes extraordinary by the day. And the latest is that Novak Djokovic, the world's #1 tennis player, effectively he posed for a photograph surrounded by youngsters without a mask, and only a day after his lawyer said he tested positive for COVID-19. So this means that he was either being extremely irresponsible or he didn't have the virus. Who knows? But this
and of course, and having the virus is the reason for his exemption in Australia that he applied for.
Well, absolutely. This is all part of an ongoing saga involving Djokovic, and it's very hard to know how it will pan out. But he's undoubtedly one of the greatest players ever, and he quite rightly has fans all over the world. But I have to say that this COVID story has turned him into an anti-hero, and he's now detested by millions. And he's still in an immigration centre in Melbourne. Apparently, he's eating awful food.
Maggoty food, they say.
And he's effectively being treated like a prisoner. So, you know, you see normally stories about money and celebrity trumping everything, but the fact that Djokovic is already effectively being incarcerated suggests otherwise in this case.
But he's just being treated like everybody else, though, isn't he?
Yeah, but the trouble is with Djokovic, his body is a temple, isn't it?
Well, so's mine.
And he has his own nutritionist to give him, you know, and he's just before a major tournament that he wants to win. The longer he stays in that hotel, the more unsettled he's going to be out of his comfort zone, isn't he?
My heart bleeds.
Yeah, you don't have an awful lot
I
of
have no
sympathy for him, do
sympathy.
you?
I have no sympathy at all.
Well, as someone who's, you know, I'm very pro-vaccine, I would completely disagree with Djokovic's views on it. I mean, he, like many elite sports people, he has some pretty crackers views when it comes to health. He's got this idea that you can talk special energy into water. He thinks that you get different energy from different places. He's got, obviously, a very strict nutritional regime. Lots of things that I might think, oh, just have a packet of crisps and shut up. But, you know, I'm not an elite tennis player. But in relation to this, you know, whether or not you go to Djokovic for your medical advice is up to you. But the way I think that the Australian government is using this is not necessary. It's not that Djokovic is kind of patient zero, a huge health threat. It's not that even that Australia is at a point at the moment where allowing someone like Djokovic to come in would be a problem. I think he's become a sort of folk devil in that he's being used to make a wider point, which perhaps isn't necessarily fair on him. Saying that...
Except, if this picture is right, as Nabila said, either he tested positive for COVID and didn't bother, or he didn't actually test positive at all.
So, yeah, saying that, stories like this which show that there is still that kind of old level of elitism among celebrities where they feel like the normal rules don't apply to me. And unfortunately, with Djokovic, it's becoming harder by the day to defend him.
Yeah.
OK, Ella, the Observer, looking at the Colston statue.
Yeah, I think this was just an interesting way into it because within the Observer they have an sort of semi-interview with Rhiannon Graham, who was one of the Colston Four and has become the kind of spokesperson for the group. And what she's really saying is she's hitting back at the criticism of the jury verdict. And she's saying, don't misuse our acquittals as part of this feeble war on woke. And the interesting thing about it is that I think there's two things going on with the Colston verdict. There is the thing that a lot of people can't get their head around, which is that, as the Observer points out, Graham brought rope to the demonstration. You know, very clearly on footage that was captured of the day, you know, everyone had a phone without filming it. There was lots of evidence that showed that these people were involved in tearing down the statue. And so in relation to the hard law of what constitutes criminal damage or not, I think lots of people are scratching their head and saying, how can a jury have come to this? But the important thing is that the Colston Four and Graham herself has said that we weren't arguing that we had engaged in criminal damage. In fact, what we were doing was righting the wrongs of history, and that the offensiveness and the abusiveness of the Colston statue remaining in place meant that legally we weren't in fact doing criminal damage, we were doing something positive. And I think that's where you have to say that there's two things going on here. There's the legal case, but there's also a political problem, which is that you cannot solve the political culture war issue of statues, of whether or not people want Churchill, whether or not people want Colston. You know, in terms of offensiveness, Oliver Cromwell is outside Houses of Parliament who murdered, you know, countless numbers of my ancestors. I'm Irish. I don't think I'm going to be going down with a rope and pulling him down anytime soon. But the politics of this discussion can't be solved in the court.
But is this why it has to go to the Court of Appeal? Not to try to overturn the verdict, but in terms of looking at the precedents of all of this.
Well, the legal arguments that were allowed to be argued.
Yeah, but if she's saying, well, we were righting historical wrongs, well, that does give a carte blanche for other people to do what they want.
Well, it's tricky because jury verdicts don't necessarily set legal precedents. And I feel very strongly that at a time when juries are quite often called into question in relation to other court cases, very much want to defend the idea that a jury of your peers decide what your fate is. That's a kind of fundamental point of our belief in justice and liberty. But the political aspect of this, about the idea that an inanimate object like a statue could inhabit so much emotion of abuse or be so offensive as to warrant this kind of legal decision. That's the interesting thing. And I don't think Suella Braverman's move to get this to the Court of Appeal will change that, because that is a political issue that happens on the streets, that happens among people, and it doesn't get solved by a ruling by a judge.
What do you think of the so-called wokery of it as well? I mean, should there be a committee on every council now looking at their statues or, whatever that could be causing offence and actually taking a responsible view?
So, lots of people don't like the word woke. Some people think I think it can be a little bit silly. But the idea that that statues or monuments or things that exist in the world can cause us such grievous harm as to be compared with what Colston did, which was engage in the slave trade, and no matter how much he tried to whitewash his decisions his moves afterwards by giving a few quid to the poor, the wrong of that being compared to a statue existing today, I think is a complete perversion. And you end up in a situation in which you paint these Colston Four people are painting the citizens in Bristol as so in need of protection, as so sort of fragile as to be threatened by a statue. And I think that sets quite a dangerous political precedent.
Isn't the bottom line that you shouldn't take the law into your own hands, and all this can be sorted through education, effectively? Educating people about the legacy of Colston and right the historical...
Sometimes you have to, though, don't you? Throughout history, sometimes you have to actually take the law into your own hands to make a point, because nobody will listen.
Well,
statues have been toppled all over the world, and actually at the end of this Observer article, it makes an interesting point, which is that this is part of Colston's history. The statue was put up at a certain time. It's been torn down now. It is a part of history. How we deal with that history, I think, should be more open than it being... I think it leaves a slight sour taste in people's mouth watching these 4 young white kids turn up on the court steps and say, we have won a moment for racial equality.
I still feel the verdict would have been slightly different if those 4 young people happened to be black and wearing hoodies.
Yeah,
that's
very much so.
That's a very fair point.